Can a saint play video games? What do you think? Can a saint play video games? Well, I think very shortly we will find that the answer to this is yes, a saint can play video games, and allow me to explain why. So right now in the Vatican, I don't think it's happened yet, but I think they're setting up for it, is a very important canonization that is going to occur. A canonization is a special mass where the Pope will declare people saints. And when I was in Rome studying many years ago, I was able to go to a couple. It's a joyful celebration in St. Peter's Square. There's people from all over the world. And up on the Basilica of St. Peter's in the facade, usually the Mass is outside if possible, they usually have big posters with images of the saints who are being canonized. And usually, oftentimes, those saints kind of look from a long time ago. It's hard to kind of connect with them. Their clothes aren't quite what we expect. They were kind of living a long time ago. But the two saints who are being canonized very shortly, when you look at them, kind of they seem much more contemporary to us. So the first of these saints to be canonized is Pier Giorgio Frassati, who died in the year 1925. And we'll talk a little bit more about him shortly. But he lived in Turin, and when you see his image, he's wearing a suit, maybe not quite like the suits we would wear today, but he looks quite similar. He died as a young man around 25, I believe. He has a big smile on his face in the picture that they've posted there, the big banner, rather, in the Vatican. So we have one is Saint Pier, soon to be Saint Frassati, and the other image that you can see right now hanging outside St. Peter's is of Carlo Acutis, and he's dressed really as kind of a lot of us might dress today. He died in the year 2006, and so he's becoming known as the first millennial saint. And Carlo Acutis also was famous for being an avid gamer, for playing video games. So very shortly he'll be made a saint, and we can declare that saints can indeed play video games. So I want to talk a little bit more about these saints, not simply about video games, but how their lives might teach us something about today's gospel. Because today's gospel is one of those times where Jesus is speaking strongly. It can be a hard gospel to wrap our minds around, and Christ, of course, does that at times. He uses very powerful language kind of to grip us, to wake us up, to focus on what is important. And Jesus in the gospel today uses this strong language, talking about hating father and mother. He talks about unless we give up all that we have, we cannot be his disciple. So what is Jesus getting at today in the gospel? It would seem that what Jesus is wanting us to focus on isn't that we have to kind of have a hate for our parents or leave everything, absolutely everything behind. Some are called to leave all behind. But what Jesus is getting on is what we root our identity in, what we place our foundations in. What at the end of the day, when we ask ourselves, what's the most important thing in my life? What is it? And Jesus in the gospel today is responding that our identity is to be a disciple, and our foundation is the cross of Jesus. And this was quite a radical statement at Christ's time. So if you were to ask people at the time of Jesus, what's most important about your identity? Who are you? What defines you? People might answer it in different ways, but they would say, well, the family I've been born into, that kind of defines who I am. And your family ties were very, very important. If you were born into a rich family, that meant you would be rich, you would be well off, you would have power, you'd have authority. If you were in a poor family, that was kind of your lot in life. That was your identity. Also, we could consider perhaps the money that they had, the influence that they had. These are the things that they would kind of root their identity in. And still, too, for us, this can happen. We can define ourselves solely based on who our family is, solely on who our job is, our education that we have, how many possessions that we own, and these things are important. But these are not sufficient foundations on which to base our life, our hearts, our entire being. At times in our families there can be difficulties, there can be struggles. If that happens, does our identity crumble? What happens, for example, we've become very well educated, but something happens even to our health and we cannot practice that or use our job. What then becomes of my identity, of who I am? Jesus then is using certainly very powerful language in order to challenge us to reconsider our relationship with family, with possessions, with jobs. But he's trying to show us in the end that these things are not what is central to our lives. They are not what we should root our identity in. Rather, Jesus explains that our identity is to be a disciple of Christ. Our identity should be rooted in the cross of Jesus. Who am I as a person? Who am I supposed to live like? In the end, this is to be Jesus. We could say that, of course, our birth is an important day. We wouldn't be here without our birthday, but maybe at times we consider our birth, the family we're born into, where we're born into, to be the main thing that drives our identity. But when we consider another day in our life, namely our baptism, perhaps this might be, after our birth, the most important day in our life, when we are reborn to be a disciple of Jesus, a son and daughter of God, called to be disciples of Christ. Therefore, our identity should be rooted in Jesus. We're disciples and we follow his way. And it's only really when that is at the center of our life, when we see in proper perspective all these other things that can be, of course, very good. Family, work, our education. When we're rooted in Jesus, we know how to relate to different people in our life, our family. We know how to use our job well, our relationships well. When we're close to Jesus, kind of the strength we gain from Jesus, the impact, the grace we receive for him is transmitted to all other areas in our life. And this, I think, is where we could learn great lessons from soon-to-be saints Pier Giorgio Frassati and Carlo Acutis. Pier Giorgio Frassati was raised in Turin, and in fact, he was raised in quite a well-to-do family. But he used kind of his upbringing, his advantages in life, and his money to serve those who were in need, especially the poor. And much of the work that he kind of carried out was unknown to his family and friends. It seems they kind of only discovered it at his funeral, when many of the poor of the city showed up to pay their respects when he died. Pier Giorgio Frassati was also a popular person. He had many friends. There's images you can see of him climbing mountains. But he would use his relationships with others. He would value those people, but he would want to lead them to Jesus. His relationship with Christ really impacted everything else. That was his identity, and it allowed him to relate properly to all those other areas in his life. Carlo Acutis was the same, and it's interesting to have this soon-to-be first millennial saint, someone who grew up with the internet, playing video games, very close, very similar to our situation. But he used all this, really, to express his love in Jesus. Carlo Acutis is kind of famous. He was there online, on the internet, and he really had a great love, especially for the Eucharist and Our Lady. And he used the internet, digital technology, to promote devotion to the Eucharist. As I mentioned before, he was quite interested in video games. He had many close friends, but all he did in his life was really shaped by his relationship to Christ. So in light then and intercession of these soon-to-be saints, we can perhaps ask ourselves this evening, what is most important about my identity? What is the most important foundations in my life? There are, of course, so many important things in our life. Our family, our marriage, our education, our friends, what we do for work. But in the end, let us once again affirm that because of our baptism, what is central to our identity is to be a follower of Jesus, and we shape our life on his path and on the cross.